Okay, so we will get started. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Matthew Engelke. I'm the director of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life here at Columbia. It's my pleasure to introduce the chair for this panel on the centenary publication of Carl Schmitt's Political Theology. To say that political theology in the generic is with us and relevant today is not difficult to substantiate. From the machinations of populist politicians and the rulings of judges on the limits or not of presidential exception, to the ritual and spectacle surrounding Queen Elizabeth's two bodies just last month, political theology and its opening onto concerns with sovereignty are with us everywhere. The impetus for tonight's event is the centenary anniversary of one of the most influential texts in and on political theology, Carl Schmitt's short book of that very name, Political Theology, 4 chapters on the concept of sovereignty, which was published first in 1922. In that time, in the past 100 years, but especially the past few decades, Schmitt's notion of sovereignty, his assertion of the persistence of theological appeals in secular politics, and the very idea of political theology itself have become hugely influential. They have shaped our understandings of everything from state power to the war on terror to the abject subject. Schmitt has also been controversial. Indeed, this seems to be one of the few things that his friends and foes agree upon, according to George Schwab in his introduction to the English language translation published by the University of Chicago Press. In this panel discussion, leading thinkers reflect on the past, present, and future of both political theology, the book, and political theology, the concept writ large, which long predates Schmitt. What does this concept offer now for an understanding of our world? A century on from this book, how should we think about and act upon the notions of sovereignty or miracles or sacrifice that Schmitt and so many others have brought to the fore? You will, I hope, hear something about Schmitt tonight, given the title. But as the initial conversations leading up to this event made clear, each of our speakers, as indeed our chair and moderator, intend to bring others into view. Speaking of our chair and moderator, it's my pleasure to say a few words of introduction for Timothy Vasko. Professor Vasko received his PhD at Cornell University in 2018, having studied previously at both the Johns Hopkins University and the University of Victoria. An assistant professor in the Department of Religion at Barnard College, Tim is the author of several articles addressing themes of political theology, the history of political thought, above all doctrines of discovery, and indigenous religions. His current book project is tentatively entitled The Invention of the Indigen, Native Information and Doctrines of Discovery in the Early Modern Americas. Conversations with Tim over the past few years have been one of my regular highlights of joining the faculty at Columbia. Well beyond his areas of specialization, Tim and I have had conversations ranging over Nigerian political philosophy to the new materialism. He is an unusually insightful and careful thinker, and I'm so glad that he agreed to chair this panel. He is also a part of this discussion. The point of having colleagues here at Columbia chair these events is to get their perspectives on the topics and issues at hand, and to bring a kind of fourth point of view to the table. So while Tim will shortly introduce our speakers, and they will each speak for 15 minutes or so, Tim will then lead them in a group discussion, pulling together the various threads of ideas that they bring to the fore. After that, there will be time for Q&A from the audience. So please do remember your questions, and if they pop up for you at any time between now and the Q&A portion of this evening's event, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You should be able to see it there, and Professor Vasko will be able to select and read out some of those questions. A few other points of housekeeping. We're going to run this evening until 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And finally, let me just offer a few words of thanks, first to our co-sponsors, the Department of Religion at Columbia and the Department of Political Science, and above all to the team at IRCPL who are behind the scenes and make these events possible. So with that all, I'm going to turn over to Tim. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthew, for those very kind words. And thank you to the IRCPL for organizing this event. And you, Matthew, in particular, as well to Gabriella Lee for helping to coordinate. I just want to begin briefly by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the traditional homelands of Lenape-Wappinger people. And it's an honor to introduce tonight's speakers, J. Kameron Carter, Nancy Levine, and George Shulman. J. Kameron Carter is currently Professor of Religious Studies and co-director for the Center of Religious Freedom and the Human at Indiana University. His work is situated at the intersection of questions concerning race and the current ecological ravaging of the earth. In addition to numerous scholarly articles, poems, and public commentaries, Professor Carter has recently served as the special issue editor for the journal American Religion and is co-editor with Sarah Jane Shervanack of the book series The Black Outdoors, Innovations of the Poetics of Study at Duke University Press. His current monographs include Race, a Theological Account published by Oxford in 2008, and the forthcoming Anarchy of Black Religion, a Mystic Song, which he describes as volume 1 of the Black Study of Religion trilogy, due out on Duke University Press in 2023. Nancy Levine is the Brooks and Suzanne Reagan Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University. Professor Levine's work is concerned with the relationship between religion and Western modernity. She was a founding member of the editorial board of the SSRC blog, The Immanent Frame, and Professor Levine has published 2 book monographs, Spinoza's Revelation, Religion, Democracy, and Reason on Cambridge in 2004, and Powers of Distinction on Religion and Modernity on Chicago in 2017. Her current work focuses on the freedom of interpretation, a motif that appears in 2 recent articles, both of which appeared in 2020. The first, Religion of Confrontation, Concepts, Violence, and Scholarship, appeared in the Harvard Theological Review, and the second, Canon, Repetition, and the Opponent, Interpretation in the History of Ideas, appeared in the Journal of Religious Ethics. Last but not least, George Shulman is professor at New York University, where he teaches and writes on political thought in Europe and the United States, as well as on Greek and Hebrew tragic and biblical traditions. He is the editor of the volume Radical Future Pasts, Untimely Political Theory, published by the University Press of Kentucky in 2014, and the author of 2 books, Radicalism and Reverence, Gerard Winstanley and the English Revolution, published on University of California Press in 1989, and more recently, American Prophecy, Race and Redemption in American Political Culture, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2008, which also won the David Easton Prize in Political Theory. And this is in addition to dozens of other articles and essays that Professor Shulman has published. Most recently, Professor Shulman's work has appeared in the journal Political Theory, Engaging with the Philosophy of Fred Moten. I'm now going to turn it over to our presenters, each of whom will speak for about 15 minutes. And as Matthew mentioned before, we'll then move on to about 20 to 30 minutes of moderated conversation where I'll ask tonight's speakers to engage one another on shared themes and questions that emerge in the course of their respective comments. Following that, we'll open the conversation up for some Q&A from the audience. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professors Carter, Levine, and Shulman.
Okay. Matthew, I am to go first. Is this correct? Just want to make sure.
Yes, yes, please do.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Thank
No,
you
I
very
think we're
much.
just going in alphabetical order, yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. I just wanted to make sure. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm just honored to be a part of this conversation with this august crew. I want to honor the fact that you've asked us to speak for about 15 minutes. And I want to basically just read from some material that I'm working on now. I haven't really prepared anything fresh or new, but I would like to relate the stuff that I'm working on now to the theme of Schmidt's Political Theology text at 100, published basically a century ago, 1922. This is connected to a book project that I'm finishing now called The Religion of Whiteness, an Apocalyptic Lyric, which is the second volume in a trilogy of works that I've given the general title of The Black Study of Religion. The first volume is coming out next year. It'll be out about mid-year, so late spring, mid-year. And that project is called The Anarchy of Black Religion, a Mystic Song. So I'm going to read from the working introduction of this new project, and along the way, I'm going to relate it to Schmitt. A key figure in this new project is engaging Du Bois's work, but a kind of critical thinking with Du Bois, not merely a kind of effort to sort of repeat him or do kind of like simply exegesis around Du Bois, but rather to relate him to current issues of the day. So in that context, I'm gonna, along the way, relate this to, or at least drop nuggets of potential connections to Schmitt. In fact, maybe I'll just kind of lead and just sort of let my main claim lead right out of the gate, and then I'll read what I have. The basic claim I'm going to argue is that Schmidt's political theology and his production of this term, the production of the text in 1922, at the moment he produced it, was symptomatic of something else. It was basically symptomatic of a kind of instability, a kind of fracturing of the religious terms of Western domination, imperial and colonial domination, that was registering in the instability of constitutional statecraft. Hence, Schmidt's own concern with the terms of constitutional statism, and his whole notion of sovereignty is a part of his efforts to sort of give a kind of theoretical understanding of the basis of constitutional statecraft, and rooting that in the idea of sovereignty, and that as a kind of, as he puts it, a secularization of a theological concept. That's number one. Point number two is that at this same historical conjuncture, just a little bit before Schmitt, in 1920, Du Bois's Dark Water is also registering the same problem. However, Du Bois's account of it has a longer historical arc at this point, and Du Bois is relating the crises that are confronting constitutional state and the emergence of the settler colonial state of the United States into a vanguard of Western state leadership. He relates this to a long history of what Schmitt will call political theology. Du Bois will isolate this problem of political theology as symptomatic of a kind of instability within Western imperial domination. He will relate this to what he calls the religion of whiteness. The religion of whiteness is a term that Du Bois deploys in his chapter 2 of Dark Water. That chapter is called The Souls of White Folk. And what I'm basically arguing is that Du Bois's 1920 term, the religion of whiteness, and Schmitt's 1922 term, political theology, are basically terms that are describing the same conjuncture. which is also to say then that Schmitt's notion of political theology is also a notion of the religion of whiteness. Even if Schmitt does not deploy these terms, but knowing the itinerary of Schmitt's political practice, where he takes his concepts and his own kind of political investments, we can sort of see the trajectory of the kind of authoritarianism that he's about, that is working in tandem, or is another kind of way of looking at the very thing that Du Bois called the religion of whiteness. So that's a real schematic kind of way in which I'm putting these two thinkers together. And in light of that, I'm just going to read a little bit just to give you a little taste of some of the ways that I'm trying to think this out a little bit closely. I'm watching my time because I'm going to be really respectful of the time here and honor the time of my colleagues as well. So let me just go ahead and jump in, and I'm going to share my screen a little bit so that you can see some of the epigraph quotes to this, what I'm getting ready to read. So hopefully this will go right. Here we go. Share my screen here. Okay, I hope you can see it. Okay, you should see a big screen here, The Religion of Whiteness, or the Black Study of Political Theology. If you don't see this, maybe one of my, someone can just let me know if you don't see it.
I can see
beautiful.
It, but yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, but it's small. On my screen, it's small. I don't know if that's because of my view or not.
Is it?
Okay,
is
yeah,
it,
no, that is because of my view. Okay, sorry. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, no problem.
Speaker view. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm assuming that everything is good right now then. All right, so this is the epigraphs to what I'm getting ready to read. Of course, is an image of Du Bois. Epigraph number 1 comes from The Souls of White Folk, the chapter in Dark Water. I do not laugh, I'm quite straight-faced as I ask soberly, but what on earth is whiteness that one should so desire it? Then always, somehow, some way, silently but clearly, I'm given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen. And the next epigraph, also from The Souls of White Folk. The prior one, I'm sorry, this is a completion of the first epigraph. This is a completion. I'm sorry, I didn't want to cram it all on one. So let me finish this next statement. Now, what is the effect on a man or a nation when it comes passionately to believe such an extraordinary dictum as this? And to believe it is manifest daily, wave on wave. Each virulence is dashing this new religion of whiteness on. Okay, so that the prior this one constitutes one quote. It's at the beginning of the chapter, The Souls of White Folk. Now, the next quote comes at the very end, where Du Bois says, "Back beyond the world and swept by these wild white faces of the awful dead, why will this soul of white folk, this modern Prometheus, hang bound by his own binding, tethered by a fable of the past? Well and good, O Prometheus, divine thief." Again, this quote comes from the very end of The Souls of White Folk. The first one that I read is from the very beginning. This one is from the very end. And then lastly, I have Du Bois's really terse but powerful formulation out of Souls of Black Folk, 1903 book, many of us are familiar with, where Du Bois says in the chapter eulogizing his son, the passing of the firstborn, he has this phrase that says, "Beyond this narrow now." Okay, so I'll come to this genealogy thing in a second. I'm going to just read for now just a few pages, and then I'm going to jump. I'm going to skip over some stuff in the interest of time, and then I'm going to get to this genealogy because I really want to put this on the table. Leading journalists, scholars, and public intellectuals have been giving important attention to the new white supremacy, or what one writer has called the white reconstruction that is currently afoot. For some, this has taken the form of analyses of the rise of authoritarianism as a feature of the crisis of democracy and democratic institutions. Relatedly, it has also taken the form of analyses of the rise, specifically of white nationalism in the United States under the presidency, the former presidency to be precise, of Donald J. Trump and its ongoing persistence in the post-Trump era, if this is in fact a post-Trump era. As we know, these twin crises of democracy and white nationalism culminated in the January 6, 2021 mob attack on the US Capitol, inspired and egged on by then outgoing President Trump. The mob attack sought to stop the transfer of power from then President Trump to incoming President Biden. Stopping the transfer was to occur by the mob, whose goal was to kill, as they said, then Vice President Mike Pence, to prevent him from overseeing the Electoral College vote, which in the US system of government is the final formal step in certifying the election and moving forward with the transfer of power from one presidency to the next. Others still have analyzed the new white supremacy in the context of anti-Black police violence, signified by such names as George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the COVID-19 global pandemic that is now endemic, arguably. And finally, but quite relatedly, there are those who are considering the new white supremacy from the angle of a general socio-ecological and environmental ravaging of the earth. This earth ravaging, driven in large part by large-scale fossil fuel extraction, one writer has called it petrodespotism, has enacted a once slow but now not so slow violence against surplus people, quote unquote, often women and children, often people of color. Think Flint, Michigan, think more recently Jackson, Mississippi. This is an environmentalism of the poor, quote unquote. One writer persuasively insists that it is a misnomer to name this the problem of the Anthropocene. Rather, this writer persuasively insists that it's not the Anthropocene, it's the white supremacy scene, or the geological color line. That's a quote. In writing the book I'm working on, this book, I join a host of writers increasingly interested in this problem of the not so new white supremacy. However, what I contribute to this important conversation and debate on these urgent issues is the claim that behind the various problems just enumerated and others that I have not, that is behind both Trump and more broadly, a now endemic Trumpism, Trumpism lay the problem of whiteness itself. Across the pages of this book, I argue getting to the root of the problem of white supremacy requires an understanding of whiteness itself as a historically distinct and specific form of religion that operates as a planetary empire and socio-ecological or earth catastrophe. While in making this argument, I very much have my eye trained on the present. While making this argument, I very much have my eye trained on the present. I will carry out the argument itself by thinking with writer and public intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois, who roughly 1 century ago, at the second decade of the 20th century, diagnosed the national and international problems of his day: police violence and lynchings at home, a war, World War I, as we've now called it, abroad, a global pandemic, what was then called the so-called Spanish flu, the beginnings of a worldwide recession in the 1920s that will become a global depression in the 1930s. He read all of this as indications of what he called the new religion of whiteness dashing upon the shores of our time. This book is an effort to understand this phrase, the new religion of whiteness, that Du Bois gifted us a little over 1 century ago, and that appears in the first epigraph that heads this introduction. It's my belief that Du Bois's insights into what he called the new religion of whiteness, or into whiteness itself, and not just its most right-wing expressions in white evangelicalism or in white Christian nationalism, but whiteness as such. Whiteness as such unfolds between the statements of the epigraph. The first two come from Du Bois's Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil, 1920. Also, again, roughly 1 century ago. This is the lesser read, lesser known companion text to the more well-known Souls of Black Folk of 1903, in which Du Bois penned those lines now immemorial. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Souls of Black Folk is also the text where Du Bois delivered to us the third of my epigraphic statements, in passing of the firstborn, Beyond this narrow noun, whiteness being that narrow noun that holds us all hostage. But more than any other text, it is the statements Du Bois gives us from Dark Water that will be our guide into the problem of whiteness. For while Dark Water is lesser known than Souls of Black Folk, its rhetorical formulations nowhere near as emblazoned upon us as are those of Souls. It's not because they shouldn't be. For indeed, what I here propose is that if the 20th century was of the Souls of Black Folk, then in order to reckon with the intensity of an intensifying racial violence, coupled with an intensifying ecological crisis, both global and reach, ours is an era of dark water. More specifically, ours is an age particularly in need of what is said in the second chapter of Dark Water, the chapter titled The Souls of White Folk, and especially what it had to say then and what it says to our now about that wave upon wave, each with increasing virulence, in which there is a dashing of this religion of whiteness on the shores of our time. I here take up Du Bois's provocative formulation gifted to us a century ago, the religion of whiteness, as in fact a term of Black study that can help us both understand our intense moment of white reconstruction, as Dylan Rodriguez has recently put it, and as a flashpoint from which, beyond which we might enact modes of assembly and gathering with each other and with the earth that are in flight from the religion of whiteness. Such assembly whose habits must be renewed is what I call Black ecology, what others have called Black sociality, what we might further dare to call, after National Book Award winning poet Nathaniel Mackey, he called it nerve church, and that I further annotate perhaps as dark church, which I can talk more about in its distinction from Black church. It's related to Black church, but when I say dark church, I don't just mean Black church. Anyway, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna skip a bunch of this and I'm gonna just jump to this genealogy, because the genealogy is really important. I can probably talk through it a little bit quicker and then bring this to a close so that those coming after me can go ahead and put their stuff on the table and we can talk about it more in our conversation together. But the genealogy that I'm arguing here is that Du Bois basically, by the time we get to 1920, and Du Bois gives us this formulation of religion of whiteness in the Souls of White Folk essay, he had been working out an argument basically in which the genealogy of whiteness converges with what Carl Schmitt will call political theology. That is to say, a genealogy of whiteness and a genealogy of political theology converge upon each other. That is, whiteness is a modality of political theology. In fact, I would go so far as to say, and this would be interesting to talk through, that political theology is a locution of whiteness. And in that sense, I'm actually not quite interested in recuperating it, that there might be a version of a Black political theology or whatever have you, a queer political theology, so on and so forth. I take it that political theology as a locution, as a term, and particularly in the moment of its emergence, reveals how much it is basically a formulation about whiteness itself as a modality, as political theology. And I think Du Bois was getting at this, and in some sense, kind of beats Schmitt to the point. And this genealogy that I'm gonna kind of like schematically lay out here about Du Bois's work and how he gets to this, I hope will show this. So let me go forward here. For Du Bois, the genealogy of whiteness, I'm arguing, is a genealogy of political theology. And here's basically I developed this in the book, so this is really schematic. But basically, Du Bois's genealogy of whiteness as a genealogy of political theology begins with his 1820, a paper that he wrote in 1889, He is an undergraduate at Harvard University. He's in a class, a philosophy class. The class is called Philosophy Fore. He's taking it with the pragmatist philosopher, William James. The course is a semester-long, two-semester course. It covers the entire 1888, 1890, 1889 academic year. At the end of the second term, he writes a paper for James called The Renaissance of Ethics. And in the Renaissance of Ethics, Du Bois basically, course, tells the story in effect of how medieval scholastic theology sets the terms of modern statecraft logic. And he shows how it works. He has a reading of aspects of Thomas Aquinas's philosophical theology, taking it all the way up to the emergence of the early modern philosophy of Rene Descartes and Francis Bacon. The big point of the Renaissance of Ethics is that Du Bois wants to argue that the imprint of scholastic theology has never left us. We remain trapped within it, and the whole possibility of a world structured around contingency and chance, that things can happen contingently and chance can actually operate, and therefore change can happen, basically gets curtailed by scholastic theology, the way in which it imagines God. So in this paper, he lays this out. In 1890, academic year later, in June of 1890, Du Bois offers the undergraduate commencement address at Harvard. He's enters into a competition. He is selected by the faculty at Harvard to deliver the undergraduate commencement speech. There's a whole issue around how the racial logic and racism worked even in the selection process, but we won't go into that now. At the end of the day, he was selected, and he gives this undergraduate commencement speech in 1890. His topic is Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States of America, the break-off Southern states that were on the southern side of the Civil War. Jefferson Davis had just died in December of 1890. So there was a lot of hand-wringing in public culture about the significance of Jefferson Davis. A young undergraduate Du Bois makes Jefferson Davis the topic of a speech. And at the end of the day, what Du Bois shows is he brings forward aspects of the argument that he makes in his Renaissance paper, that argument about scholastic ethics, theological ethics, into the specific context of the US as a settler colonial state. And he argues that Jefferson Davis is a template of political theological practice of whiteness. And at the end of the speech, he offers up what he calls what I call the figural Negro. He talks about the figure of the Negro as an alternative. The Negro is not Jefferson. The Negro represents an alternative sociality altogether. We can go into the details of that later, but I'll just hold it at that point. After 1890, in 1903, we have the Souls of Black Folk. And I contend that in the Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois is picking up that thread about how the Negro stands in contrast to Jefferson Davis as what he calls the strong man. And you get a different sociality, a different form of faith practice, what I've increasingly been calling Black faith, as an aesthetic practice, not as a creedal and doctrinal practice, but as an aesthetic practice, as an art. Souls of Black Folks is picking up that thread about the Negro as alternative to Jefferson Davis as strongman. Then in 1907, Du Bois writes a biography of John Brown. And in effect, what you get there is John Brown, he gives a reading of John Brown in which John Brown basically makes a decision to break from basically his own formation into whiteness and move in the direction of what he learns from the Negro. That will become a kind of setup for what Du Bois will do in 1911 and then again in 1920. In 1911, we get the first version of the Religion of Whiteness essay. It's at the beginning of the decade of 1911. Then by the time we get to the end of the decade, he revises it and significantly develops and expands it and makes it chapter 2 of Dark Water. And this is where we get that phrase, the religion of whiteness. By the time you put all of this together, I've even left out what he does in his novel, 1911, I think it's 1910 or 1909 novel, I'm forgetting the exact year, Quest of the Silver Fleece, in which he develops further dimensions of this. But by the time we get to 1911 and 1920, Du Bois will have laid out a kind of, built a genealogy of whiteness as rooted in a kind of political, theological practice and ethical consciousness. Also have begun to lay out an imagination of Black life that is not simply a Blackened version of political theology, but a fugitive alternative altogether. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. I put a lot on the table and I can fill in more details if we want to later. The big punchline here is simply to say that on my reading, that Du Bois as a kind of flashpoint within a kind of Black radical intellectual tradition is already giving a reading of political theology that is not melancholic of the kind of weakening or the kind of fracturing of the constitutional state, but actually is an analytic of the constitutional state as rooted in theological practice, as an instance of theological practice, which he then will come to call whiteness in 1911 and then 1920. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. Thank you very, very much for your patience. I think I went over, but I hope I didn't go over too much. Dear, thank you very much.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Nancy Levine. So I do not find it generative to read Carl Schmitt, but I am interested in the work of readers who do. Thus, I am glad to be here today, and I want to thank Matthew Engelke for the invitation, Timothy Vasko for chairing, Walid Hammam and Gabriella Lee for organization, and my fellow panelists for their work on this topic. My indifference to Schmitt is partly due to the fact that my scholarly areas of interest have not included the study of political emergencies, dictatorship, the relationship of politics and the state to law and constitutions, the conflicts between democracy and liberalism, or the intellectual apparatus of Nazism. Just give me 1 second, my thing is weird. Okay. Like most intellectuals in the last 100 years, I have given thought to such things, but not with any expertise. Is Schmitt important on them? I cannot imagine he is. So plodding are his readings of other thinkers. So fanatical are his tone and apparent aims. So unilluminating is he about persons and therefore groups. Yet my indifference extends here too. If he is useful on these subjects, you say, I would not devote any time to arguing with you, and I will doubtless learn something. What I can contribute is to offer a plea for alternatives to Schmitt on the topic of the book under discussion, Political Theology. Schmitt's non-novelty on the minimal claim does not matter, nor does my periodic surprise to find him taken seriously. My single act to keep faith with Schmitt's work and to speak with other readers whom I respect is to take it that in the 66 pages of Political Theology, which, mostly meandering, feel much longer, he means to give us a single sentence, the book's first sentence. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. Here are some related sentences, which I do not read in order. The exception is more interesting than the rule. These are all from Schmitt, Political Theology. In the exception, the power of real life breaks through the crust of a mechanism that has become torpid by repetition. What characterizes an exception is principally unlimited authority, which means the suspension of the entire existing order. Because the exception is different from anarchy and chaos, order in the juristic sense still prevails, even if it is not of the ordinary kind. All law is situational law. The sovereign produces and guarantees the situation in its totality. Like every other order, the legal order rests on a decision, not who is responsible for that for which competence has not been anticipated. This is still Schmitt. Looked at normatively, the decision emanates from nothingness. And here's my last sentence from the book. All significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, etc., but also because of their systematic structure, the recognition of which is necessary for a sociological consideration of these concepts. The exception in jurisprudence is analogous to the miracle in theology. This last sentence helps me say why I keep faith with Schmitt by reducing his thought to a single sentence. At issue is not only the sentence I myself choose, in which you and I can debate whether it is the most representative one. It is that Schmitt himself is interested in reduction, in systematic structure. And here he is again. Only by being aware of the analogy between miracle and exception, God and lawgiver, can we appreciate the manner in which the philosophical idea of the state developed in the last centuries. So if I am wandering on philosophical mountains with my alternatives to Schmitt in hand, I'd like to close off the path to Schmitt, not because I do not perceive the endurance of fascism in the modern world or the antagonisms and perils of democracy. It is that in a philosophical register, his sentences, that is, his concepts and readings of others, matter more than the mere impression that he has gotten close to something troubling and is thus worth refuting, defending, or transposing into another case. My question of that pass is Schmitt right that the sovereign is he who decides on the exception? He who, in expressing the origin of legal order from nothingness, is not himself also subject to this order? No, he is not right. That is to say, here are 5 claims. 1, sovereignty, power, authority may stand outside, i.e. external to, the order in and of which it is constitutive. I take outside and external to mean for Schmitt not subject to review, not subject to limit. Sovereignty may take this form, in which case the system, inclusive of both itself and its uncontrollable origin and end, is in contradiction with itself. The social, political, and ethical outcomes of this state of affairs are rightly troubling. The question is, how could one intervene? And even how and from where could one understand? 2, sovereignty, insofar as it constitutes another type of distinction than contradiction, is at the best of times paradoxical, and so conceptually troubling, and humanly so as well. Sovereignty, as another word for power, is, as many have argued, also a word for justice, or its opposite. Sovereignty or power authority, let's say, concern whether a polity can be just, and when and how to make it so, and when and how to critique and amend it insofar as it falls short. Nota bene, Schmitt seems not primarily to have had justice in view, but many of his readers have. Nota bene, in their recent tome, the Davids, Graeber, and Wengrow claim that sovereignty, quote, always represents itself as a symbolic break with a moral order, end quote. A concession which affords them room to advance their alt freedoms at the cost of thinking with Schmitt's premises, which they do not acknowledge. 3, it's not surprising that Schmitt does not avail himself of other models of sovereignty or give a philosophical account of his own. He is neither a responsible nor an insightful thinker, no different than any other failed aspirant to the game of the philosophical idea, as he puts it. He is useful only as a negative example, not of bad and opportunistic thinking, why bother, but of the concept of sovereignty as contradiction. 4. If we do not conceive sovereignty Schmidt's way, what can we say of other ways? 5. There are good sources of the concept of sovereignty as paradox. I pretend no special insight in offering this concept, only a desire again to close down Schmitt. My claim above all is that Schmitt is not helpful even on the concept of sovereignty he himself propounds, the one in which the sovereign is in contradiction with the system. In order to comprehend his state of affairs, in which we could neither intervene nor even understand, to see in short Schmidt's model, a myth whose only application is to give flimsy cover to hypothetical tyrants, you have to be thinking from the other model, in which sovereignty in paradoxical relation to the system looks like contradiction only when it's in flight from the more basic structure, which requires more of it. Schmidt's position would be what Hegel calls one-sided, but not the fact that the side it attempts to express is already impossible. The thing outside the thing is neither itself, since it is also inside, nor its other, since it is also outside. The more basic structure of sovereignty, or justice, or power, can be seen in how Kant handles the problem of freedom in the Critique of Pure Reason and the Critique of Practical Reason, and in how Spinoza handles the relationship between human and divine laws in the Theological Political Treatise, and in how feminists, queer theorists, critical race theorists, and the like handle the problem of changing the conversation. Continuing in abstract terms, the thing outside the system, to be thought, is what the system offers to practice. The system cannot express its own principle except through the practice of justice. There is nothing outside the system, not violence, not force, not decision, except justice, which lives nowhere, inside or out, but in practice. Derrida says justice is always to come, meaning that of no given act may we say, there it is. Yet it is no different to say that of any given act, there it may be. Justice is not only to come, it is now, if we will, but practice it. In short, if the exception in jurisprudence is to be analogous to the miracle in theology, it behooves readers to study what can be realized in and through both metaphors, and how it is possible to practice them. Kant is especially helpful to expose the structure of the term Schmitt offers. Insofar as I make decision, or miracle or exception, the contradictory outside, I have merely extended the terms of the inside to a putative outside, which is instantly self-refuting. Or as Kant dryly put it, it is dialectical. The decision merely takes the terms of the legal order and places them in one case beyond dispute. An obscene, if laughable postulate, any undergraduate reader in the history of philosophy and theology should be able to deconstruct. Or should I say any child of any parent? Insofar as we are speaking about obscene and sophomoric tyrants, all the more. Why use this model rather than another one? Or in other words, why use their model? In sum, shall we stop talking about Schmitt? Let's. His decision to trip into the metaphysical does not require us to follow him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I'd like to invite George to present his work now.
It's kind of fun to be the last one. I'm maybe slightly more sympathetic to Schmitt but the basic direction of my remarks is my own version of Nancy and Jay's arguments. I first encountered what is now called political theology, though we did not use that term, in 1976, when Berkeley political theory graduate students gathered informally to read the Hebrew Bible as a work of theory. I had been bar mitzvah, but my religious education included only a few stories reduced to didactic ethical messages, never the actual biblical text in their enigmatic complexity. To actually read the Pentateuch, the Kings, Prophets, and Job was revelatory, transformative. I was able to grasp how central these texts were to so many thinkers and arguments in the political theory canon, and to the literary artists I wanted to include in that canon. I saw that the literary and rhetorical complexity of the text composing the Bible resisted the didactic readings characteristic of orthodoxy, but also its philosophic profundity and poetic beauty defied the reductionist assumptions of leftist atheists like myself. At the same time, I was writing my dissertation on the mystic Christian communist Gerard Winstanley, whose Digger experiment in 1640s England drew on biblical symbolism to present a radical alternative to the emerging hegemony of a Hobbesian modernity. But again, I did not use the term political theology to depict their divergent projects or my own readings. When I moved back to New York in 1985, I taught a course called The Bible for Leftists to adults at what was then called the Marxist School and later the Brecht Forum. They responded passionately to the ethical and political dilemmas dramatized in the Bible, especially Exodus, of course, and their intense debates replayed the whole history of the left. Soon after, I published my first essay in political theory on the implications of the Cain and Abel story for thinking politics. And again, I did not use the term political theology. Before 9/11, one of my undergraduate theory seminars was called The Bible in Political Theory, and biblical and gospel texts in it were supplemented by excerpts from Machiavelli, Rousseau, John Winthrop, and Blake, followed by Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, Dostoevsky, Kafka, and sometimes Tocqueville on civil religion. I always concluded with Baldwin's biblically inflected essays on white supremacy as theology. Still, I never used the word political theology. I mean to suggest here, in this bit of personal history, my distance from any equation of Carl Schmitt and political theology, and also from Schmitt's versions of sovereignty and nomos, decision and exception, miracle and redemption, or friend and enemy, each richly imagined by Hebrew prophecy, Greek tragedy, Talmudic hermeneutics, heterodox Christianity, and by my mentors like Blake and Nietzsche, Melville, and Baldwin. To condense my own conception and practice of political theology in negative terms, I would say I want to save political theology from Schmitt, but also from reduction to philosophy, from canonical conceptions of the properly political, and from the binary logics that separate the sacred and the profane, as well as the ordinary and the exceptional. Put positively, I interpret political theology in poeticizing, politicizing, and democratizing ways to recover what Schmittian political theology renders invisible or devalues or precludes. I conceive political theology as this, and I'm not simply getting rid of the term, as the study of what I will call organizing faiths. First, the trope of faith foregrounds how creative imagination is embodied in sentient, suffering, desiring, socially entangled bodies. Second, the trope of faith foregrounds how creative imagination is expressed in mythopoetic metaphors and images, in colloquial idioms and folktales, and then in scriptures and other genres, including treatises now called political theology. Third, organizing faiths are always instantiated in ordinary, customary, ritualized social practices. Both imaginative poetic forms and ordinary social liturgies of living are tested and contested, made and remade as people make the struggle to make sense of the historical and natural exigencies that shape their lives and experience. The conception of political theology that I would advance would shift our sense of theological practice and of its political predicate. Rather than philosophically test the validity of truth or truth of creedal arguments and define theology by creed or religion by creed, I take a phenomenological approach to explore how imaginative poesis is linked to both paideia and to praxis, to practices of subject formation and to acts of world building. Rather than define the political in terms of sovereignty or as a secular translation of theological concepts, I foreground agonistic practices of popular power, expression, and action amidst conditions characterized by inequality and contingency. In my version of political theology, suffering and aspiration are always twin and always imaginatively metabolized in vernacular idioms and aesthetic artifacts. Those are embodied in customary rituals and materialized by collective action. Organizing faiths become truths and forge the we who holds them as self-evident. In my view, therefore, what we call faith is both inescapable and ubiquitous, animating every dimension of human life, whether people worship a god or reason, invest faith in a nation, a race, a church, or a state, in property, in markets, in divergent political projects or personal experiments. Such organizing faiths are often tacit, entwined with lived experience, motivated in complex ways, articulated by rhetorically resonant speech acts, instantiated in social practices, and always open to reshaping as participants struggle to make sense of themselves and of life. In the spirit of Hebrew prophets, Blake, Nietzsche, and Baldwin, my mentors, I ground political theology not in logos, but in poesis, in imaginative invention, in myths, fictions, narratives, metaphors, and images by which human beings conjure and name, explain and express, also protest and mobilize their suffering to make it able by making it meaningful, but also to remediate or end it. By such visions, they seek redemption and risk failure. They seek hegemony and provoke contest. My practice of political theology thus would analyze the face that we already, often tacitly, enact to assess their worldly cost and impact, to trace failure and revision, and to articulate alter faiths to enrich or displace them. Against a liberal distinction between religion and politics, quote unquote, I follow the Machiavellian and then Gramscian premise that faiths manifest constituent power as they are woven into rituals of congregation and festivity. Politics is thus, as Gramsci said, church-like in mobilizing constituencies and shaping forms of government. Politics, quote unquote, is not just government or state action, but collective self-fashioning to forge or disturb collective subjects, to advance or contest shared imaginaries, to make or remake social practices and whole regimes. Accordingly, an organized can fail when, in a Machiavellian sense, it does not sustain its authority and vitality and cannot adequately organize the collective energies that Durkheim called mana. As an organizing faith fails to make sense of experience, elicit attachment, or enable flourishing, incipient voices of prophetic revelation, innovative theories, or newly resident narratives emerge to revive or displace a once dominant political theology, quote unquote. Following Lincoln, I thus construe democracy, quote unquote, as an organizing faith and form of life, now in acute crisis. If political theology is reimagined in these ways, I think it can help us grasp and address the crisis in the faith and social forms long governing the Euro-Atlantic world. I think Schmitt tried to address that crisis by recovering the creative, mythic, political, and existentially meaningful energies he captured by ideas of decision, exception, and miracle. But I see him intensifying this crisis by his devaluation of ordinary life and by his insistence that only sacrifice and sovereignty could redeem it. I seek a counter theology to Schmitt by putting Nietzsche and Baldwin in conversation. On the one hand, by dramatizing the relationship between the secularizing Enlightenment project and nihilism, Nietzsche sought a way to newly posit values, as he put it, through poiesis and plurality rather than sovereignty. But on the other hand, in ways that Nietzsche never theorized, the episteme that he called the ascetic ideal is also the racial regime of white supremacy that established a global color line through colonialism, enslavement, and the discourse of the human. As Nietzsche saw theist and rationalist faiths at war with the Dionysian, Baldwin saw liberal modernity wed to domination by its war on the blackness of life. Baldwin literally cast whiteness as a theology that stipulates the damned and damnation to produce the saved. By this redemptive logic, those who call themselves white and human would secure exemption from suffering by mastering those made to signify the blackness of life. And in this sense, I'm totally agreeing with Professor Carter. Baldwin's Nietzschean argument about whiteness as theology cast Schmittian political theology in a new light. Against Schmidt's view of a procedural and pluralist liberalism, a focus on race suggests that the sovereignty of the liberal state is founded and renewed by violently imposing a racial state of exception that constitutes friend and enemy. American liberal nationalism thus weds citizenship and whiteness by sovereign violence. It makes social death for those marked black the condition of life and liberty for those deemed white. Baldwin also unpacked the meaning of whiteness as theology by showing how it links blackness to the flesh, to death and transience, to irrationality and loss of self, to regressive erasure of boundaries, to both chaos and madness, and yet thereby to life and aliveness. Fear of blackness and disavowed attraction to it are manifest then in the psychodramatic rhetoric about black bodies and existential threats in the psychodramatic rhetoric of American politics. The psychic and cultural features of fascism, which renew patriarchy and racial nationalism, thus appear within the liberal Enlightenment that since Hobbes has authorized itself against the primitive and regressive. Baldwin's sense of liberal modernity as a burning house, a deranged and self-destructive regime, is even more manifest 60 years later. But Baldwin also revisions Schmittian decision and exception. For across the theological and political frontier created by white supremacy, those marked black are called to a decision to take exception to the racialized state of exception enabling Euro-Atlantic modernity. If Black life is lived in a violent state of racial exception, within a political structure of antagonism, not pluralism, in the wake of a slavery never overcome, in ongoing conditions of social death that characterized its afterlife, the question is, what counter-theologies might address the nihilism of whiteness, the sovereignty and crisis of sovereignty in the liberal state, and the crisis of faith in democratic politics? Those are the stakes in what Fred Moten calls socio-poetic insurgency. And I want to emphasize the socio as connected to the poetic. Partly, it would revalue the meanings of Blackness to engender a yes to life. Partly, it would transfigure the meaning of traumatic histories in way of a traumatic history in ways animated not only by grievance and in the register of justice, but also by pleasure and beauty in the register of the aesthetic. Partly, it seeks aliveness less by organized politics and more by modes of aesthetic creativity, not by heroic public sacrifice, but by shared practices of remembrance, repair, and improvisation in ordinary life. Enacting a rebirth of tragedy out of the spirit of music, Black forms of socio-poetic insurgency prefigure another world imminent in this one. I would call this a counter-political political theology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. I would like to just invite everybody, all of the panelists, to turn their cameras back on. All right. Thank you. So it looks like we're at about 6:40 and we've already got questions coming in. So I am going to, in my capacity as moderator, ask maybe just a very short beginning question and then move on directly to the questions from our audience. So thank you very much, Professors Carter, Levine, and Shulman. I have to admit, I was like, as you were all giving your presentations, I had to completely revise my question because everybody seemed to come to the point that I thought I would ask, and then get the conversation going. So I'm going to ask a much simpler question, which is that there seems to be some kind of loose consensus on the panel that maybe, if not Schmidt's time has come and gone, that he's a very limited kind of resource, and maybe has been for quite some time. And I think all of you have sort of demonstrated that there have been several plausible and even preferable alternatives to Schmidt's account of the relationship between authoritarianism and jurisprudence, between crises of politics and legal order, and the metaphysical and theological underpinnings of those questions central to political theology. And yet, there seems to remain, at least for some, a kind of macabre fascination with Schmitt. And so, and I'm thinking especially of particular strands of theory in the new materialism. Bruno Latour continues calling for, say, like a Schmittian political theology that casts, anybody against what his new climate regime would look like as a kind of enemy. And I kind of want to invite the panelists to reflect on what it is, not necessarily why certain scholars do or don't go to Schmitt, but what it is that his name seems to signify in kind of broader critical discourses on the relationship between politics, religion, law, philosophy, and particularly various forms of authoritarianism and injustice. What does it do to cast one's work under the umbrella of Schmitt, and what does it say about at least the work that has been done so far on the attempt to think these kinds of problems together, that so much of it has run through the kind of Carl Schmitt trajectory?
Could I make a stab at that? I can't speak for everybody across all disciplines, but among political theorists, there was real conflict about Schmitt and whether he could be redeemed in some way, because of a certain kind of an idea of antagonism, number one, and that there were significant conflicts of interest that both people concerned with out of a Marxist tradition and an abolitionist tradition wanted to hold on to. That liberal pluralism didn't get to the kind of antagonism that Schmitt emphasized. And then secondly, because there was this kind of generative, I want to call it a kind of vitalism, and people tried to take Schmitt's notion of constituent power to talk about kind of vitality in politics and in a way alive again after it's so desiccated by liberalism, I think. So there was a kind of, among political theorists, a kind of ambivalence or fascination with Schmitt, almost everybody separating it out from a kind of a state sovereignty. But there was something there people wanted to hold on to.
I myself don't have anything interesting, I don't think, to say to the question of why people are fascinated with Schmitt. You know, other than I'm tempted to make just a more general question, or pose a more general question of when do, within, let's say, you know, the humanities and social sciences, when do senses get to stand, right? Just like at a simple level, you know, so there's of course what becomes influential, what's taken up, but just in terms of what's sort of true or not true, what is the case or not the case, just kind of a lot of, that sounds good, that sounds interesting, or maybe that's kind of true-ish, or maybe there's something in that, and then I think if you look a little more closely, you know, and kind of how the concepts work, I don't know, I think maybe Schmitt doesn't stand up, but maybe he's not for that, but I just think there's reasons to just say there's nothing useful. I mean, I just, you know, if you look closely, I don't know, I just, but I don't know. I mean, people have to say if they're finding it generative.
I'll maybe jump in, and I mean, I'm not a Schmitt specialist, and I'm also with you, Nancy. I'm kind of not interested in Schmitt. I guess I'm interested in the degree that he coins this term that people continue to be interested in, and so I have this like step removed interest in him. I'm interested in the uptake of this term that he's produced, in the various concepts he's produced around this term, political theology. Well, resonating, why people keep giving them a certain attention. So I'm interested in that. And I do wonder, this is completely speculative, but I do wonder if the interest in Schmitt, the concepts he's produced, is partly a lingering symptom of the fracturing of what was believed to be a kind of coherent Euro-American, but especially European, but by some extension Euro-American project. I mean, that is to say that the fracturing of Europe after World War I, then into World War II, that kind of undoing of a politics of the West. I think Schmitt still, in many ways, his concepts do. His concepts are related to that stuff. And I think to the extent that we remain, the we here becomes a Western we, remain in the throes of that incoherence, of the fallout of a fracturing. For me, it's always been incoherent, but when the veil of that incoherence gets the lifting of the veil around that coherence becomes lifted, so that we have to contend with a kind of fracturing and a kind of breakdown. I think Schmitt becomes an interesting kind of totemic figure at that point, who can like kind of stand in for a kind of anxiety, so to speak. And in his day, it seems to me, 1922, I thought about Schmitt in relation to Du Bois, but another person you could put him next to is Karl Barth, the theologian Karl Barth. Karl Barth's going to come out. He's going to go in another direction than Schmitt, to be sure. He's going to do his own thing. But in many respects, it's a similar conjuncture. He too is contending with the middle of the second decade of the 20th century, when the wheels are starting to come off. And the whole Rama Brief project, his reading of Romans and building a kind of dialectical theology out of the Rama Brief, particularly the second edition of the Rama Brief. Well, the verse too, in its own way, but the emphases are different there. But between the first iteration, the first edition of the Rama Brief, and the second, you see Barth also trying to reckon with what Schmitt will call political theology. What's the relationship between what is called the political and what has been called the theological? So there are a number of people, I think, trying to make some sense of what's happening, and particularly from the vantage point not of the colonized, not of those who have suffered the would-be coherence of a European project, of a Western project, but the Western, from the inside of a kind of Western interiority, when that begins to fracture, a number of concepts begin to proliferate. They come online to try and reckon with this. And I read political theology not as a kind of natural concept. I take it to be historically produced at a particular moment, reflecting a particular kind of crisis. I also read Schmitt in this regard next to Freud. I mean, Freud generates a series of concepts, also kind of reckoning with this moment. Mourning and Melancholy comes to mind as that crucial essay, also generated in the middle of the second decade of the 20th century, similar conjuncture with Du Bois, similar conjuncture with Barth, and I would argue again, contending with a kind of internal incoherence that is now becoming unabatable, or something like this. So I'm interested in people's continued taking up of that concept, and if the continual taking up of that concept signifies in some sense that we're still in the grips of an incoherence, that people are to like kind of rectify, trying to suture that incoherence vis-a-vis these concepts.
Thank you so much. Maybe I'll just ask one quick follow-up and then move on to the questions that I'm getting into in the Q&A. One thing that was going through the back of my mind as you were all talking was this debate that Schmitt gets into that most people don't think about when they read political theology, with his contemporary legal theorist Hans Kelsen. And essentially the debate there is whether the source of sovereignty is Schmidt's version of the kind of omnipotent quasi-miraculous lawgiver, or whether, according to Kelsen, the source of sovereignty is in fact the international legal system in which sovereigns are mutually recognizing one another. I'm not sort of trying to propose that we all become Kelsenians, but all of you seem to be suggesting that there's a more pluralized, contingent, and, especially if we pay attention to, as Professor Carter suggesting, the kind of, precipitous undoing of the kind of classical Western imperium that's sort of lingering and rumbling in the background of Schmidt's political theology, which results in sort of the modern international as we come to recognize it in the mid-20th century. I'm wondering if I could invite all of you to say a little bit more about what the work of thinking, either with a revised version of political theology, as Professor Shulman has proposed, or throwing the term political theology out altogether and thinking in those kinds of coalitional and maybe disaggregated but coordinated ways across groups that have typically been left out of the genealogy of political theology that Schmitt wants to draw, what that might look like as a kind of new foundation for a kind of claim to and vision of political life.
Well, I think my paper was sort of incoherent in the sense that I used the language of organizing faith to really get away from what seems entailed in the concepts of the political and the properly political and the properly theological. But then I didn't quite simply reject or say the concept of the political theology, theological was unredeemable. But I think in practice, what I'm doing is simply leaving it behind. For all the reasons Professor Carter said, it's really because of the focus on sovereignty, it's a real symptom of a breakdown and an attempt to kind of cement together what needs to be actually blown up. And that's why it's connected to whiteness and the redoing of whiteness in a kind of our own fascist moment. And the alternative to that has to be just in these very different, way more imminent and pluralized ways that don't involve sovereign states recognizing each other either, I don't think. But I think what I'm saying, what I'm doing is trying to get away from it altogether.
Yeah, I want to differentiate what I'm doing from that. I just don't, Schmidt wasn't making recommendations, that we should, or whether he was or not, it doesn't matter, that somehow the for me is not that we don't like omnipotent lawgivers, we prefer international orders or plural inclusive domains or regimes that bring in people who have been left out. It's not what we prefer. It's more just, how do you think about the circulation of authority? What models are there if you're going to reckon truthfully with disruptive and antagonistic, violent and seemingly ungrounded elements in so-called rational regime of consent or democracy? And what I'm saying is, even if finds it fruitful, and one might find it fruitful to use, but Schmidt's not very good at it. He's just not. He doesn't understand, basic biblical theology. He's just a kind of hack when it comes to thinking about let's say the relationship, a covenantal theology in which the divine is, let's say, a principle of creation and the people are able to hold God to account or whatever. So it's not it's not the one with divine lawgivers or not divine, or we're not done with divine. It just, if you're going to have a divine lawgiver, don't go to Schmitt. And isn't the whole point of Schmitt that somehow he says, this is what politics is? I don't know, it just all seems not fruitful. It all seems very just not deeply learned. It's just sort of hackery. So I don't even think it's kind of like to be seriously set aside. I just think it's, and as for people who have taken it seriously, you know, I have no account for them. That's fine, but let's not.
Yeah, I mean, so much what you said, Nancy, I'm sympathetic to. I'm sort of very much there. As far as the way the opening question was framed, if I'm recalling right, I think you said, I think you were mapping out, Tim, two kind of approaches here to how authority is being thought about. On the one hand, you know, authority vis-a-vis a modeling around God as a sovereign, which, as Nancy has, I'm in many respects quite taken by. Schmitt might not be good at actually developing that whole approach, but let's just stipulate it. Authority on the model of God as a sovereign, or authority on the model of a kind of recognition between states. And, you know, here I'm thinking of the Westphalian international order, that it's the recognition of those states that constitutes an international order in the first place. In my mind, at least, especially when I think about not only the Schmitt of political theology, but that text, 1922, but the Schmitt of the post-World War II text, Nomos of the Earth. It seems like those two can be put together, at least for Schmitt somehow. Schmitt's going to argue in Nomos of the Earth, he's going to give basically a reading of the logic of sovereignty towards the Westphalian international order. And he's going to explicitly kind of like tie it up with, you know, the transatlantic as a kind of geopolitical space. And he's going to invoke, interestingly, and I don't think unimportantly, the theologian Francisco Vittoria to sort of ground what he's doing in the building of the international order. And he's going to basically read Schmitt, who was an important reader of Thomas Aquinas, and the whole Franciscan, the whole the school of Thomas thought coming out of Salamanca, Spain. Schmitt's going to be reading that Victoria in order to make the argument of how what the West takes to be sovereignty grows out of colonialism. And he's basically going to argue that in many respects, that's what's lost in the liberalist consensus, the forgetting of the specificity of the kind of sovereignty he's talking about. The specificity of the sovereignty he's talking about is on the one hand, he wants to claim a certain reading of the divine sovereign, God as a divine sovereign, now being secularized as a secularized concept. But by the time we get to Nomos of the Earth, he's actually showing his hands explicitly that actually it's a colonialized concept. It's a colonialized reading of the divine sovereign. And he's clear about that. He's going to quote Victoria, and he's going to say that, and in fact, the vision of sovereignty as a certain kind of state logic and state practice that he's going to read through Victoria is positioned when you read Victoria over against Native peoples' practices, various Native peoples. And so, you know, now you're getting into the kind of the logic of the settlerism and, you know, how various Native peoples imagine their relationship to the land, relationship to the earth, and whether the whole discourse of sovereignty within the register of a certain kind of Western statecraft is even suitable to talk about their relationship to the earth. But you have a contending understanding of what it means to be related to each other and with the earth. And Schmitt sees that melancholically. He's in mourning about it. He sees it and he wants to return to it. And I think that for me, this is the heart of the problem. And this is where it gets to, you know, the specific theopoliticality of whiteness in its very production. it's rooted in these very issues here. But by the time we get to the first text of, well, the early text of 1922, you know, a lot of that is buried inside that text. It's there, but it's buried inside it, which is why I like Du Bois, because Du Bois basically has already smoked it out before, you know, before Schmitt can write his opening sentence. He's already smoked it out.
Thank you both, or all three of you, very much. So we are at 7:02, and I want to be respectful of folks' time. I think, you know, so there is one specific question for you, George, in the Q&A about the relationship between organizing faith and Habermasian constitutional patriotism. And then there are other questions in the panel, two other questions in the Q&A about how we sort of reconcile this claim of historical accuracy and empirical precision vis-a-vis Schmitt, and what that would mean if we were to take the project of Black study that I think has been put on the table very seriously. And then there's a somewhat related question, I think, about the status of the political or politics as it relates to sovereignty distinctly. With just maybe to give you all a couple of minutes to maybe offer any closing thoughts in relation to any or all of those themes that have come up in the Q&A before we shut down for the evening. Maybe 1 minute each.
My 1 minute response to the question that was directed to me is that Habermas's constitutional patriotism is an example of a kind of organizing faith that is very close to kind of the religiosity of American civic nationalism. And I think it's completely in crisis. And it ends up being subject to all the symptoms that Professor Carter is finding in Schmitt. It's actually not an alternative.
I can jump in with a closing remark on this question about the political. This is something I've been wrestling with a lot, and I go back and forwards, but mostly tend to increasingly land in the same place because my own kind of dissatisfaction or finding it difficult to find a way to recuperate the notion of political theology, even as I have a number of like dear friends who press me constantly being pressed, well, maybe I can do business with it. And I always seem to come out on the other end saying, no, I don't do business with this term. And I think a big part of it has to do with the idea of the political and such, that the political, particularly in a Schmittian framework, but I don't think you just have to do it in a Schmittian framework. When you analyze the production of politicality in modernity, you can do this with Sylvia Wynter and her notion of man one. Homo politicus is man one. And she argues how man one is generated out of the kind of colonial. And so for Wynter, the political is not an innocent term. There's no universal idea of the political that, you know, everybody has the political and we can just do it different ways, whatever. That modernity is constituted out of a particular entity, the democratization of sovereignty, as one political scholar has put it. And I think Schmitt has a similar idea that for him, the political is a structure of contestation. And more specifically, it's a structure of antagonism. It is constituted through what he will call the friend-enemy distinction. Like this is the whole concept of the political, the argument he makes in that essay. It's constituted through the friend-enemy distinction. And then by the time you get later down the line, like mid-1960s, he does a series of lectures that become the book, The Theory of the Partisan, where basically he revisits the notion of the political as a structure of antagonism. And he says basically that, you know, the notion of the partisan is in many respects even worse than the enemy, because if the political is constituted through a friend-enemy distinction, where one version of politicality can supplant another version of politicality. You might even think of it in terms of like a kind of an east-west struggle. You can think of it between the Occident and the Orient, that kind of struggle between East and West. You know, do we go in the direction of a kind of Putinism or something, to put it in today's kind of political struggles on the international stage, or do we go in the direction of the West, where Ukraine is kind of like stands in for the West? That's a kind of like structure, a friend-enemy distinction. But the partisan for Schmitt is worse than an enemy. The partisan is that figure whose ways of life actually brings to a conclusion the very imagination of the political as we've given it. And so the partisan almost gets read as a proto-theory of the terrorist. I think that for Schmitt, his idea of the political is built upon that kind of structure of antagonism. And at that point, you know, it seems to me that Afro-pessimist theorization becomes really, really interesting, because what they read as modern structure through the structure of US antagonisms, if I use Frank Wilderson's formulation, is very consonant with the way in which Schmitt imagined politicality.
Absolutely.
And it seems to me that when Fred, for example, Moten, for example, talks about the socio-poetic, which George, you brought up, I think it's crucial. It's not the political poetic, it's the socio-poetic. Sociality in a kind of Motinian framework is not the same thing as politicality. It may have political implications, but it is not politicality. It's something outside of the framework of politicality as it's been constituted in modernity, you know, from, you know, if you go in a Winterian way, man one, or if you go in a Wildersonian way, the structure of US antagonisms. It's beyond the structures of antagonism that is part of the colonial apparatus, colonial imperial apparatus. And we got to figure out a way to think a modality of being with each other, being with the earth, that is not constituted through structures of antagonism, which is another way of just saying politicality. So starting to get at this question of the concept of the political, that the political is a freighted term. And it's hard for me to just kind of easily make my peace with how that term functions. I'm trying to think in some sense what's fugitive from politicality as we know it.
I'm good, so.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you especially to Professors Carter, Levine, and Shulman for their really just fascinating talks and even more fascinating comments and conversation with one another. And thank you all for taking the time to be with us tonight, and be safe and be well.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, everyone, especially for staying after. A sign of just how engaging everyone found the discussion. So thanks, everyone. Good night.